Okay, we're now recording. Let me share my screen. And there we go. Okay, brilliant. Let's go. So, as I said, welcome to all of you who are here, whether you are watching live or whether you are watching via a recording. I'm really, really glad to be here once more, to be presenting this session to you. So for those of you who have never seen me before, my name is Pula Lawton and I wear several hats. I am an educator. I was a primary school teacher for some time. And I left teaching to go and explore other things. And I went and trained to be a lawyer. And so the area of law that I love and adore is equality law and employment law and anything to do with kind of human rights and that sort of thing. When I'm not doing legal things, then I kind of go all over the world talking about equality and how wonderful it is and how we should strive for a more equal and equitable society. And you may find me in schools doing anti-racism sessions like this one for staff and children, and just kind of doing work with my organization, which is called Arise. And Arise stands for Anti-Racism in Schools and Education. So that's a little bit about me for those of you who didn't know. But let's talk about today and the here and now. So we're going to start by doing a quick recap of what we talked about last week. And then we are going to look at some very important concepts. The first is that of diversity. What is diversity and why is it important? Then we're going to talk about belonging and why having a sense of belonging is very important, especially with regards to self-esteem and raising self-esteem in our children. We are then going to move on to talking about representation and why it's important to see people from all different walks of life. Then we're going to have a Q&A session as usual, and then we will wrap up. So that's the overview for today. So let's recap. Last week, we talked about talking to your children about race and racism. And I think the main takeaway from that session is that it's really important to talk. Lots of people shy away from these topics and they say, oh, well, I think my child is too young, or I don't know what to say and I don't know what to do, which is totally understandable. But as we discussed last week, actually, I think it's really important that we start these conversations when they are young, because once you have those conversations from a young age, it becomes normal and it becomes kind of more comfortable with having those conversations as they get older. I also said that it's really important to talk about race in a positive way. So you don't need to talk about race in a negative way. And I think it's important to distinguish between those two topics, talking about race and talking about racism. So they are not one in the same, they are quite different. And therefore, talking about race is not something that you need to kind of approach from a negative view and say, yeah, out there in the world, there's racism and there's this and there's that. You can actually just have a pretty neutral conversation about the fact that people do have different races, people have, different ethnicities and so on and so forth. I also said that people of color cannot and shouldn't be expected to fight racism alone. And this is very much the case when it comes to discussing racism. So a lot of the time, conversations about racism are had between people of color. And it's almost slightly, not, I wouldn't say detrimental, but it can almost feel like a pointless exercise when you are only ever talking to people who know and who get it and whose lived experience means that they know about these sorts of things. But I actually think it's really important that everyone talks about racism and everyone has the expectation to fight against racism, not just people of color. When we're all on the same page, we are more likely to reach our goal faster. And last but not least, last week I said that it's really important to have these conversations because if we don't, children will start to guess and fill in the gaps with their own interpretations. And this goes for a lot of kind of difficult conversations that you might want to have with a child. Lots of parents, when I was a teacher, parents used to say to me, oh, well, actually, I don't want to talk to my child about that because of whatever reason, which is fine. But then I always used to think to myself, if you don't tell them, if you as parent or guardian do not tell them, they are going to find out on the playground from someone else. And it will be someone else who doesn't exactly have the same subject knowledge as an adult. And it will probably be misinformation. So it's easier and better in the long run if it's us, adults, who have these conversations with children. So that's what we talked about last week, but let's talk about diversity. And this is one of my favorite things to talk about because it's a fact of life. Diversity is everywhere we look. We are so fortunate to live in one of the most diverse cities in the world. There is diversity everywhere in London, which is an absolutely wonderful thing. But beyond London, there is diversity all over the world. As I said last week, there are about 8 billion people on the planet, and we are all pretty different. So I think it's really important to make that point to your children that diversity is everywhere and we are all diverse. And so a way to explain what diversity is to a child is saying diversity is about including people from all walks of life. It's about empowering people by respecting and appreciating what makes us all different. And that can be in terms of age, gender, ethnicity, religion, disability, sexual orientation, education, and national origin. It can also be, socioeconomic background. I think that's another one that you could talk about. It's also really important to tell children that diversity is something to be celebrated. So I just want to go back for a second over these definitions, these 3 bullet points that I've just given you, to talk about the language that I deliberately used. So if we look at this second bullet point here, it's about empowering people by respecting and appreciating what makes us all different. I think this word us is incredibly important because it's not about division and saying there's an us and them. It's not about saying, that we directly are not included in diversity. Everyone is diverse. It doesn't matter who you are. We all make up diversity. And it's important not to create, as I said, an us and them and a feeling of, we are the default and everyone else is diverse and everyone else is different. That's not the case. We are all diverse and it's inclusive of everybody. The second kind of word that I want to look at is celebrated. It's something to be celebrated. And this is so, so key. And I've deliberately used the word celebrated in opposition to the word tolerated. This is so important when it comes to matters of diversity. It's really, really key that we are using the correct language and we are telling children that we celebrate other people, not tolerate. When I think of the word tolerate, it has very negative connotations for me, and it brings up the idea that something is not necessarily wanted, but we put up with it anyway. So I always say to the children, or I use whenever I'm doing assemblies and things like that, you tolerate a runny nose. Okay, it's not nice. Nobody wants to have a runny nose, but you put up with it. You tolerate it. We don't do that with people. We do not put up with people, tolerate them, kind of just go along with it because we have to. That's not a nice way of describing the relationships that we have with other human beings. I think celebrate is a much more appropriate word, and it's just a nicer and happier word altogether. So when we're talking about diversity, please make sure we are not using the word tolerate. We're not saying, oh yeah, we put up with this, or we have to do this, or we have to do that. Let's talk about it in quite a positive way that doesn't kind of bring up those negative connotations. Celebrating. How do you celebrate diversity? You can do this in so many different ways. So many different ways. You can talk positively to your children about people who come from different walks of life. Now, I know that I am mainly here within the capacity of somebody who talks about anti-racism, but I think for the purpose of this webinar, I think it's really important to talk about diversity in all its forms and not just racial diversity, because there's an overlap there as well. And it's important to know that all of these things can be applied to all the categories that we looked at before. So when we were talking about, sexual orientation, ethnicity, gender, age, religion, disability, education, socioeconomic background, national origin. So when we're talking about diversity, you could, and everything that we discussed today can be applied to all of those things as well. So I think it's really important to talk positively to your children about people who come from different walks of life. Even though I recognize that we live in London and it's wonderful, and like I said earlier, we live in one of the most diverse cities in the world, it's still very possible for your children to grow up in a bubble. And if they go to a school that perhaps isn't diverse, and I know that's not the case for Rhodes Avenue. Rhodes Avenue is a relatively diverse school, and that's brilliant. But it's very easy to kind of just exist in your assembly of and never really talk about or see people from different walks of life. So I think it's important that we take that into consideration and we therefore talk to children about the fact that people live life differently. Okay, one thing that I found absolutely fascinating is that, and I'm not going to name any institutions, but I've worked in a borough where on one side of the borough there was extreme levels of wealth, and on the other side of the levels of poverty. And it was really interesting working where there was, you know, it was quite a wealthy school, and a lot of these children actually didn't know that just 1 mile down the road there was a lot of difference. Okay, there were people of color who lived in this area of London, and there was lots of poverty, and there were, you know, life was very different down the road. And it shocked me because I thought to myself, gosh, how could you not know about this? And I'm talking about older children in year 5 and 6, where actually I think it's good to start having those conversations about socioeconomic difference, and they start to bring that up and recognize that. I found it really interesting. Children didn't actually know that this is what was happening 1 mile down the road. So talk to your children about things that are happening in your immediate area and things that are happening across London. It's really important that they don't grow up kind of, I know we want to share our children and we want them to be protected, but I think it's important that they know in terms of developing empathy as well, that actually the way that they live the one and only way to live. Let me just can we make sure that we're all on mute, please? I'm going to mute everyone. Hold on a second. Bear with me. Thank you very much. Okay. I hope I haven't muted myself. No, I haven't. But as I was saying, I think it's really important that children know about the world around them, and you know that there are other things that are going on in the world and what have you, because it allows them to develop empathy and understand that life is not just linear and there's not just one way that one can live a life. The same could be said for things like ethnicity and religion and so on and so forth. Again, really interesting how you can grow up in London and be fixed in this bubble. And I had an extremely negative experience as a teacher one time. When I was teaching year 5, I took my children on a school trip to, I don't know where we were going, but we ended up going through an area of London that had a big population of people from a particular religion and who were wearing religious clothing, and the children really didn't know what to do. They really behaved in a way that I don't think is appropriate. They were pointing, they were laughing, they were making fun, and they were doing all this. And I remember thinking to myself, that's not good. That is not good, that you grow up, that you're growing up in London and actually you've never seen this before, and you're not reacting in a way that I find appropriate. So it's important to let your children know that there are different communities out there, there are different ways of life, and that's something that you can have a conversation with your kids about. You can do this really easily by reading diverse books. As I said last week, reading diverse books is a really nice way of kind of opening up the conversation and starting a narrative about different communities and the fact that there is difference all around us. You can also use TV programs and films to discuss this. And one thing that I find absolutely brilliant is that TV and film and media in general nowadays is very different to how it was 10 years ago, 20, 30, 40 years ago. There's so much diversity in TV and film, and media outlets are doing a really good job of making sure that they are representative of the wider world that we live in, the wider communities that we live in. And that's a really nice thing for the children to see. Again, it just makes them, it allows them to develop empathy, and it allows them to see that actually there are different people in the world and we all live differently and we all look pretty different as well. So those are ways which you can celebrate diversity. But this comes with a huge caveat, a huge asterisk, and it is this. Even though we live in London, and even though, you might be reading these diverse books and you might have these diverse TV programs on in your house and what have you, it's really important not to use your proximity to diversity as a cloak or an excuse. What do I mean by that? I mean that it's very easy to say, "Oh, well, I live in London. I can't possibly have prejudices. I live in London. I can't possibly be racist. I live in London. I can't possibly. My next door neighbor is this color. My colleague is this color, so I can't be racist or whatever." It doesn't work like that. You can have all the books, all the films, etc., etc., but if you yourself are perpetuating prejudice, your child will still pick up on it. Children are so incredibly intuitive. It's one thing that I'm always massively blown away by, how intuitive children are and how they pick up on things. So if your mouth is saying something, i.e., your mouth is saying, "Yep, diversity is great and we love it," but you still are uncomfortable when you're around people who aren't like you, they will notice it. So it's really important, like I said last week, to kind of unlearn and unpick the things that we are holding inside us. So just to reiterate, children are so receptive and they are always, always watching. That's one thing that I can guarantee you. Children are incredibly receptive, and even if you think you're having a quiet conversation about something, or you think you're not being obvious about something, they'll still pick up on it. It's really quite amazing. So on that note, it's important to have honest conversations with ourselves, and it's really important to kind of want to pass on positive ideas and behaviors onto your children. um, so before we kind of, I'm just going to go back one, before we kind of move on, I just want to give you a little example of what I mean. When I was a teacher, this was quite some time ago, I was teaching, what year was it? Year two. And I had a child in my class who came up to me and she said, "Oh, Miss Lawton, I don't think my mum likes you." And I said, "Oh, that's really sad. I'm sorry to hear that. That's really sad." She said, "Yeah, because my mum tells me that you should only play with people and you should only be friends with people who are the same as you." And I said, "Okay, what do you mean by that?" And she said, "Well, my mum said, because you and I don't have the same skin color," and this was a white child, by the way, "because you and I don't have the same skin color, I should stay away from you." And she was not trying to hurt my feelings. This was a 6-year-old child. And I believe every word that she told me. I absolutely believe it. So, on that note, again, it's really important to think about what you're saying. And this is not to say that you should censor yourself in front of your children and just say those things behind their back. We shouldn't be saying or thinking these things in the first place. But children come to school and they will spill all of your tea. They will just tell you everything. And that's something that we don't want to happen. We don't want children coming in and saying, "My mum says this, my dad says this," and them growing up not accepting of other cultures and so on and so forth. But anyway, let's talk about what it means to unpack and unlearn and kind of put our own biases to one side. There is an amazing woman out there. She's an educator and she's called Dr. Siggy Cohen. And she released this this pamphlet, this really amazing PDF file back in 2020, and it's called Talking About Diversity with Your Kids. Sorry about the typo. I will be sending this to Maria because I think it's really important that you have a read of it if you can, if you've got the time. It would be really, it's a brilliant read. And within this PDF file, she talks about parents unlearning or kind of putting their own biases to one side. And she says that you should think about these questions and answer them honestly. So, how do you feel about diversity? How do you behave around people who do not look like you? What are your thoughts, both conscious and subconscious or unconscious, when you hear a language that is not your own? How do you feel? How do you speak to people from other cultures or races? How do you speak about them when you are at home? Does your body language change, your tone? So these are all the sorts of things that your children will pick up on. So if you behave differently around people who don't look like you, your child will pick up on that. If you speak in a different way to people from other cultures or races, your child could very well pick up on that. The same goes for your body language and your tone and things like that. Okay. And the anecdote that I gave you a couple minutes ago about the girl in my class, that was not the first time something like that had happened. There were many, many times where children would either explicitly tell me, "Oh, my mum said this about this religion. My dad says this about this culture," and they'll come in and they'll be speaking on behalf of their parents, their guardians, their grandparents, or whoever it was, and it's a really sad thing. So just be alive to the fact that your children are always watching you and they pick up on what you say, whether that be explicit or what you do implicitly. Just be really, really careful about that, because obviously we don't want this generation to grow up thinking those things and believing those things. It's really important that we break and interrupt that cycle. So on that note, I would really like you to think very carefully about the answers to these questions. How do you feel about diversity? And if you've answered, "Oh, well, actually, I'm not too keen on it. And actually, I don't like the way London's changing. And, I don't like this and I don't like that. And I don't like this culture or this religion," then that's something that you really need to think about and unpack and think about why that is, and think about how you can change that and what education would be necessary for you to change that, and how you can interrupt that negative cycle so that you don't pass it on to your children. So that's an exercise for all us adults to do. um, how do we therefore start a conversation about diversity? So once you've kind of looked inwards and you've recognized that, perhaps you feel a particular way about diversity, or there's something else that you want to learn about diversity in different communities and cultures and races and what have you, then and only then do I think you can start to have these conversations with your children. Because as I said before that, if you're having these conversations but your actions don't meet your words, um, it's not going to work. So you've got to do the self work first, and then you can start to talk to your children about this. So one way that you can talk about diversity is by starting with what's familiar. So you can, if you know it and you're comfortable in doing so, talk about your own family history. So this is something that I think is a really wonderful thing. You talk about, your own family, where what your journey has been like. So for me, for example, I have family in other parts of the world. I have family who are here in the UK. My journey as to how my family ended up in the UK is quite an interesting one. I have family, actually, surprisingly, English heritage, and I've been able to trace my heritage back. I think the 1100s was as far as I could go, which was really, really interesting, which I didn't know about myself. But those sorts of conversations are really important. If you don't know your family history, or that's not something that you want to discuss, there are lots of other things that you can talk about. You can talk about people within the community. So I think it's really, really important to speak well of people who you know, and have discussions and say, you know, so and so um, is, I don't know, is Muslim, for example, and because of their religion, they celebrate Eid. And then, you know, in that way, you can start to have conversations. What is Eid? How do you celebrate Eid? What is Ramadan? And so on and so forth. Okay, the same with other communities, other religions. You can talk about the fact that, for example, at the bottom of Mazar Hill, I think it's up at the moment, but usually at the bottom of Mazar Hill at this time of year, they put the council put up a huge menorah or a Hanukkah to celebrate Hanukkah, and that can be a topic of conversation. Talk about that. What is that? Why is it there? How many candles are there? Why do people celebrate this? So it's really nice to just talk about other communities, talk about other religions, faiths, and ways of life. You can talk about as well people that you see in on the media. And again, this is something that I think is so brilliant. It's changed massively because I remember thinking back to when I was a child. I don't think there were, I can't name a single visibly disabled person who I saw on TV. Now I'm thinking really hard about this, and no, I can't think of anybody who is visibly disabled who I would have seen on TV. But now, um, if you know, if your child likes CBBS or your child likes CBBC, there are presenters who are visibly disabled, and I think it's so important and so good. And I think that's something you can talk about. Okay, not to make a fuss out of it in a strange way, but recognizing it and just saying, yeah, that's absolutely brilliant, I think is really nice. So start with what's familiar. You can talk about your own family, you can talk about people in the community, you can talk about different religions, different festivals, and so on and so forth. Um, a game I used to love to play with children when I was a teacher was I Am and I Am. And it's a really, really nice game that encourages children to think about their own identity. So when we are talking about diversity, it's important to know that it's not just, you know, talking about other people. We could include ourselves, and we should include ourselves because, as I said, diversity is about all of us. And anyway, the name of the game is I Am and I Am. And the point is, your child has to name one thing about themselves. So it can be about their race, their heritage, their nationality, their age, anything. And then one thing that they enjoy. And here are some of the answers that were given to me. I think I played this quite a few years ago, actually. It must be maybe 10 years ago when I played this. And so these are some of the answers that I really, really loved. One child said to me, I'm half Indian and half Irish. So that was their identity. And I'm obsessed with musical theatre. And that was their thing that they liked. And another child said, I am 7, so their age, that's their identity, and I love Ninjago. That's their hobby or their thing that they enjoy. Another child said, I am the best at Minecraft, and I love my family in Bulgaria. And I just thought it was such a nice exercise to do because it gets them thinking about who they are as a person, and it allows them to talk about these things because these are not often things that children talk about. The children don't tend to talk about their identity in such a specific way. And it's nice to get them used to recognizing who they are as a person and celebrating their own identity. And that is something that I think you could easily do at home. And if they're too shy, you can go first. So you as an adult can say, okay, well, I'll go first. I am, and you can say something about your identity. And I am, you know, really, really enjoying a particular author, whatever it is. And the point of the game is to keep going until you almost run out of things to say. And it's so, so lovely, especially in a group or especially with other children or other members of your family. It's just a really nice thing to do to celebrate and allow the children to kind of feel empowered about who they are. So that's one that you can play. Um, and that brings me really, really nicely onto the idea of celebrating ourselves. As I said, it's really important to celebrate other cultures and communities and to celebrate diversity. But I think as well, celebrating ourselves is so important. And this is where I want to introduce the idea of belonging. So, belonging is a really important feature that I think most human beings strive for. And it's the sense that they can be their selves. So you can be yourself and you can be your authentic self, and you don't feel fear of judgment, or you feel as though you will be welcomed. So you can kind of show up as your authentic self and people will welcome you, and you'll feel good and you feel safe and happy and looked after in an environment. So when we say belonging, that's what I'm referring to. In order to foster a sense of belonging, it's really important that we do celebrate diversity. So we celebrate other cultures, but we also teach children to celebrate themselves. And at this point during the webinar, sometimes, and I've done this webinar in the past, people have said, oh, but I don't want my child to become arrogant. And it's not about arrogance, it's just about having a good level of self-esteem. And it's more about well-being and self-esteem than it is about boasting and showing off. Because if there's one thing that I've learned from working with children, is that not all children have good levels of self-esteem. So it's really important to have these conversations and give them a healthy amount of praise, and give them a healthy amount of, compliments, and allow them to celebrate themselves. And so on that note, I think one thing that we should do is encourage children to be proud of themselves in their totality and in their wholeness. So praise them and tell them that they look great, praise them and tell them that they have a great mind, because this is another thing, particularly when it comes to girls. Girls are usually traditionally praised for physical things and aesthetic and being aesthetic. And I think it's really important to tell young girls that they're really intelligent and clever as well as beautiful and pretty. And that is, this is not me making this up. This is, years of society and the way that we talk about girls and women. So it's really important to tell girls that they are brilliant, and they are, they've got a brilliant mind, and they can do this and they can do that. Of course, that doesn't mean we shouldn't say that to boys anymore. We should be saying this to boys as well, and we should be saying it to everyone else. But that's something to just take into consideration. Tell children that they are brilliant, tell them that they are really smart, and tell them that they look great. I was absolutely devastated as a teacher. And again, this is a really long time ago. This child must be at least 21 years old now. But anyway, one of the first classes that I taught was a year 5 class. And I remember having a conversation with some children um, about, I don't even know what it was about, but a girl in my class just started crying. And I said to her, I said, what's the matter? And she said, it's just really hard because I think I'm really ugly. And I was just so gutted for her at 10 years old, already feeling not good enough and saying, that negative self-talk of I think I'm really ugly was absolutely devastating. And I think it's so important that we as parents, like I said, this is not about creating arrogant children, but it's about creating happy children who don't burst into tears in the middle of class and say horrible things about themselves like that. So tell them that they look great, compliment them, tell them that they're brilliant, and so on and so forth. Talk about your own culture and your own heritage and the cultures of other people. um, but let's stick to one thing at a time. Actually, let's talk about your own cultures and your own heritage, and talk about it in a positive way. I think that's really important. So talk about your ancestry, talk about the country that perhaps somebody in your family came from, talk about the history of England, talk about whatever, and just allow them to have that sense of pride in who they are. Now, lots of people say to me, oh no, but that's not fair because some countries have really horrible histories and things like that. And I'm not saying ignore that, but nonetheless, I think everybody should be proud of who they are and where they come from. So that's what I'm trying to say here. I think it's also really important to collaborate with the school with this. So, what works really well, and I know Rhodes are absolutely brilliant at doing this, is parent teacher collaborations. So, by all means, within reason, of course, contact your teacher and say to them, if you want to go in and tell the kids a story about your own culture or your own journey or fairy tales from the specific country, please let the school know. When I was a teacher, I was always desperate for parents and members of the community to come in and do storytelling and things like that. And that can be really brilliant. Talk to the teachers about what's happening, have a look at potential events that you can put on. A school that I am working with are actually doing something called, is it called Cultural Week? I think it's Cultural Week, where children are coming in dressed in something significant to their own culture, and they're going to learn about specific countries and things like that. That is so, so important. And it's a really good way of working with the school and the kids. When you turn up, if you turn up to school, it's always so nice to see what the child's face when someone from their family turns up and does something like that. I so understand that we have working commitments and things like that. So please don't feel bad if you can't turn up. If you can't and you've got to work, then you can collaborate with the school in another way, or you can do something at home. So please don't feel bad about that. Times are hard, and I know we've got different schedules. So yeah, talk about that with the school. Try and do something with the school. If you can't, you can do that at home, no problem. But it's really important, as I said, to celebrate ourselves as well as other people. We want these children to have healthy levels of self-esteem. On that note, I just want to talk about something really important, and this is something that has popped up time again, and it actually is specifically in reference to race. And one issue that tends to crop up is the issue of hair. And that's a really important conversation that I think we should be having with our children. So, not just talking about diversity of skin color, but diversity of hair texture is another key conversation. Um, as somebody with afro hair, one of my earliest memories of racism was someone saying something really unkind about my skin and my hair texture. And to this day, it's something that happens quite frequently. And therefore, have existing with Afro hair can be an exercise in absolute resilience and toughness, because a lot of the time people don't always have nice things to say about Afro hair. So please have conversations with your children about the fact that people do have different hair textures, and talk positively about the fact that people do have different hair textures. And some people's hair is straight and it goes downwards, but other people's hair is curly and it grows outwards, and that's equally as beautiful. Um, that is something that is so, so important. And I know that Rhodes Avenue are signed up to an initiative, and it's called the Halo Code. So if you go on Google and you type in the Halo Code, it's all about acceptance of hair diversity, and essentially having these positive conversations with people about hair, and telling children that actually, and adults, that people, some people have curly hair, some people have straight hair, some people have alopecia, some people have hair loss and things like that. But that's another really important conversation. So talking about hair texture as well as skin, with in reference to race. Okay, let's talk about representation. This is so, so important, and I've touched upon this a couple of times already today. Representation is so, so key, and by that I mean seeing people who look like you and seeing people who don't look like you. And I don't know who said this quote, but it's one of my favorites. You cannot be what you cannot see. And of course, the idea is generally, if you don't see anyone in a particular position, and they don't look like you. So, for example, if you don't see any teachers who look like you, anybody who, whatever it might be, whatever the job, you are less likely to believe that you yourself can do that job. And that is something that I think is that's factually accurate. So somebody who, I've had a squiggly career. I've been a teacher, and a lawyer, and now I'm a lawyer. And I didn't have any Black teachers when I was growing up, and I grew up in London. I didn't have any Black teachers. I didn't have any brown teachers. And so when I was deciding to become a teacher, I remember thinking to myself, can I actually do this? Am I going to be all right at teacher training college? Because genuinely, I was not sure. I'd never seen anyone else who looked like me do it successfully. So I started to seriously doubt it. The same with law school. By then, I was a little bit older and I had a bit more confidence, but I do remember there was that question in my mind of, I don't think I've ever seen a lawyer who looks like me. Therefore, I'm not sure if I should be doing this. And is the reason that there's nobody in this industry who looks like me? Is it because there's lots of racism there and they don't want us and whatever? Um, but my point is, it's so important to make sure children do see people who look like them doing particular things. And with representation, this is a really kind of fine line to tread, because sometimes certain communities and certain races can be massively overrepresented in particular industries. So when I go into schools and I say, okay, like, let's see what your displays look like, I want to see if there's representation. Sometimes schools will say, oh yeah, we've got this kind of display board and it's about Black history, and there will be 10 sports people and 10 musicians and nothing else. And I always think to myself, okay, there's nothing wrong with being a sports person. It's great. There's nothing wrong with being a musician. That's also great. But we know, we've seen it. We have heard. I've seen people who look like me doing those things. I think it's now time to start looking at other things. Let's look at, let Black children and children who aren't Black know that that Black people do other jobs other than music and sports. Okay, so when we say representation, really important for people to see other people who look like them, really important for people to see other people who don't look like them, because again, it creates empathy and understanding. But let's not rely on the kind of, the things that we have seen time and time again. Let's try and switch things up a bit. Um, you know what I'm going to say about books. You know I love a good book. Please introduce diverse books. And if your book does have stereotypes in it, which some do, especially some of the classics, or the ones that are considered classics for children, then I don't think it's about not reading that book. I don't think it's about saying, okay, well, we're just not going to read this anymore. You can. I think it's just about having a conversation, read the book and talk about that and say, do you think all people like this or from this culture all behave like this? And children are smart enough to say, no, I don't. So it's not about censoring and getting rid of titles necessarily, but having conversations. Um, on that topic, I think it's really key that children see themselves in books. Again, I refer to my own childhood. I don't think I read any relatively diverse books, and I was a serious bookworm. I think one of the first books that I read, if not the first book I read that was diverse, was Noughts and by a Black author, sorry, was Noughts and Crosses by Mallory Blackman. And by that age, I was already a teenager, I think. And I had never seen myself in picture books really. I'd never seen myself as a main character, and it's just very nice for your self-esteem to see somebody who looks like you in a book. And again, it's important for children to see people who don't look like them in books. There are so many titles out there, which I'll share with you in just a moment, but make sure that children are seeing different people in books. Introduce positive role models. So if you know that your child has a hobby, for example, they really enjoy um, playing the piano, I'll say, then try and find out if there are, pianists out there who have a slightly different story than the norm. Okay, so one of, I think, a life-changing moment for me, and I know I give a lot of anecdotes, but this is just to really kind of reiterate my point. I play the piano, and the first time I ever saw Nina Simone playing the piano on TV genuinely changed my life, because it was the first time I ever saw a woman who looked like me doing what I love more than anything in the world. And it was really important because it led me to know that actually, if someone who looks like me can do it, then so can I. So go and find out and say, look, there's this person who does this hobby, there's that person who does this hobby. Another example that I always give is I absolutely love ballet. And seeing Misty Copeland, a black ballerina, one of the greatest ballerinas of all time, dance ballet was just like, wow. It was so, so important. And it was nice to have a positive role model in that way. Again, have conversations with the school and talk to the teachers about what they're doing in terms of diversity and inclusion and equality and representation within the classroom. That's really important. If you can help out in some way, whether that be, going in and giving a talk yourself, because that can be really inspirational, or going in and doing some storytelling or anything like that, then please contact the school, because I know how precious that is and how valuable that is to school communities. Let's look at books that celebrate diversity. I may have mentioned some of these last week, but I'm not entirely sure, but I'm going to mention them again. But one book that I think is so, so good is called Hats of Faith, and it's by Medea Cohen. And it's a board book. It's for young children. So I would say ages 3 to 6. And on each page, it has a different type of religious headwear. It tells you what the religious headwear is. It shows you a picture of somebody wearing it, and it tells you how to pronounce it. And it's just such a nice book. And I know young children really like this kind of thing, because they may have very well seen these items of clothing out when they're out and about. So it's a nice way to talk about the fact that people from different cultures and communities wear different things on their heads sometimes. So that's a really lovely one. All Are Welcome by Alexandra Penfold and Susan Kaufman is a picture book, and I would recommend it for children aged 3 to 7. And it is literally all about, fostering a sense of belonging, and it reiterates the point that everybody is welcome and everybody belongs and everybody is equally as valuable. The Culture of Clothes by Maya Hanish is one of my favorite books ever. It's so beautiful, and I would say this is it's one of those books that you can read it to a young child, like 3, 4, 5 year old, but I would be really careful about it, because it's so beautifully illustrated, and it's quite a posh book. So those books that you get the picture books where you don't necessarily mind if your 3 year old is chucking it across the floor and things like that. This is not one of those books. So you can use it with a young child, but just be careful, because the pages are really delicate. But it would be a nice book maybe to read with a young child. So I would say, if your children are in junior school years, ages 7 to 11, then 100% they would manage with this book alone or with supervision, whichever. If they are younger than that, then just make sure that they are being really careful, because it's quite a fragile book. And essentially, it is literally a book about different countries in the world and traditional clothing from those particular countries. And it's so beautifully illustrated. I love my copy. My copy is very beaten up because I did make the mistake of giving it to a young child, but it's an absolutely stunning hardback book that I would 100% recommend. I Am Not a Label by Kerry Burnell. Kerry Burnell, I'm not sure if she still does, but at one point she used to be a presenter on, I want to say CBBS or CBBC, and she's a visibly disabled woman. And she's written this book, I Am Not a Label, and it's all about celebrities and famous people, past and present, who have disabilities, who've done amazing things. So it's very much in the same style as Goodnight Stories for Rebel Girls, if you're a fan of that sort of book. Only this is for people who have disabilities. And it's really good because it includes different types of disabilities, so physical disabilities. It also talks about mental health difficulties, it talks about neurodivergence, and it's brilliant. Lunch at 10 Pomegranate Street. Oh, sorry, age for I Am Not a Label. I think this is any age. It's quite a nice book. It's not, a skinny softback book, it's a hardback book. But I think any age would manage with this one. With the younger ones, you might have to help them reading it, but age 7 to 11, I think they could manage perfectly by themselves. Or, if you wanted to read it with them, that would also be fine. Okay, Lunch at 10 Pomegranate Street is a cookbook put together by Ottolenghi and Nigella Lawson, and it's so wonderful. It's about a house, 10 Pomegranate Street, and within this house, or sorry, block of flats, there are people from so many different walks of life, and each page is dedicated to their specific culture and literally has a recipe of how to make specific foods from this apartment or from this flat. It's so good. I know lots of school cooking clubs love this one. If your child is interested in food or you are interested in food, this is a brilliant one because you can kill two birds with one stone. You can talk about food and talk about different cultures, and you can bake and cook things and eat and enjoy. This is for all ages. I think even adults would. This is genuinely one of my favorite cookbooks. I'm not even going to lie to you. Last but not least, People Need People by Benjamin Zephaniah. I love this one. This is a picture book. And as I said last week, I did say this last week, picture books are not necessarily just for younger children. Picture books can be really informative and really good for children who are older. And, sometimes they will try and say, no, I'm too old for this, and I only read chapter books. But I think this is a really lovely one because some of the things in there are quite advanced. So I would try and read this with children of all ages. So I'd recommend it from 3 years old to 11 years old, even younger than three. You could read it with a 2 year old. I've read it with all age groups and they've all absolutely loved and adored it. And Benjamin Zephaniah is a fantastic author, poet, actor, and what have you. And it's just a great book. So these are some of the ones that I think are great in terms of celebrating diversity. Um, please have a look at them. I'm going to do a shameless plug in the middle of my session. I usually save the shameless plug to the end, but Muswell Hill Children's Bookshop is one of my favorite places in the world. Um, they can easily get these books for you, and they are so knowledgeable in that bookshop. If you go in and you say to them, I would like a book about a 10-year-old girl from this country doing this, they will find it for you. They're so good like that. So Muswell Hill Children's Bookshop is great. There are other local bookshops that you can try. House of Books in Muswell Hill. There's also one in Crouch End. New Beacon Books in Finsbury Park is another really good bookshop, and they have such a wide range. That's New Beacon is a black-owned bookshop, and it's been around for years and years, and they did really well by surviving the pandemic. So if you want to, go and support local bookshops or local black-owned bookshops, then those are the ones that you should check out, I think. But enough of my shameless plug. Um, I want to wrap up, and I want to wrap up by saying diversity is a fact of life. It's everywhere, it's not going anywhere, and that's a brilliant thing. It's something that we should celebrate. We need to talk about celebrating diversity, not tolerating it. And it's something that we should encourage our children to see as a positive, because it is genuinely a positive thing. Having said that, we're very lucky that we live in London, and it's a very diverse city. However, that's not enough. We need to make sure that we are kind of working on ourselves and not perpetuating, negative social cues that our children pick up on. So if you do yourself have, these negative feelings about certain communities and what have you, then that's something that you absolutely have to think about and have a conversation with yourself about before you do this work with your children. Because as I said, they will pick up if your actions are not meeting your words. They will absolutely know if if you say, okay, this is great and these communities are great, but your actions aren't meeting that, they'll know. So it's really important to do that work. When you've done that work, where you feel as though you have a really positive attitude towards diversity and you've fully embraced it, then you can start to have these conversations with your children. Encourage them to talk about, what they see around them. Let them ask questions. This is another thing that, many teachers say to me, and parents say to me. They say, oh, but I don't want my child to be rude and start asking questions. They're children and therefore they're curious. And a lot of the time when they ask questions, they're not doing it from a place of malice. They're doing it from a place of genuine curiosity. And I think it's nice to just tell them. So if your child does say, oh, why is that person like that? Or why does that person do this? Just say to them, because just give them the reason and say, yeah, it's great. I think it's really great that they have that they are wearing whatever it might be. And some people of this religion show that do that to show the way that they love God, or to show the way that they believe, or whatever the conversation might be. Let them be curious, let them ask questions. At the same time, we need to rein them in. We need to make sure that they're being respectful. So I gave you the example of my children on a school trip just being completely disrespectful, and that was not a time for me to say, well, kids, actually it's good that you're pointing and laughing. No, that wasn't acceptable. And so it was important for me to say, please don't do that. But when we got back to school, I ended up having a conversation with them about different communities and that particular religion. So yes, give them the support they need. Also, make sure that you are bigging them up. Like I said, it's not about arrogance, it's not about making people big headed. It's just about letting children know that they are so inherently wonderful and brilliant and beautiful and smart. And as parents, I think it's really important that we kind of just instill those values in them, that they know that they are brilliant in every way, shape, or form. Use books. Books are your best friends. I will be sending some book lists for you to look at, as well as the list that I included in this webinar. I will be sharing some other ones with the school so you can have a look at those. And if anybody has any questions, please do not hesitate to ask me. I actually love it when people send me questions and they say, how do I talk to my child about this? Or what do I tell my child about that religion? Or what do I do? I love this sort of thing. So please do not feel bad about bombarding me on Instagram or whatever it is. You can ask however many questions you want, and I will always try and answer them. Speaking of questions, does anybody have any? I'm actually going to stop recording, and I'll say goodbye to those of you who are watching this after the fact. So I'm going to stop recording. How do I do this? I'll figure it out at some point. Apologies.